All right, ready for a deep dive? Let's go. We're tackling self-improvement today, but with a twist. We're going to dig into assertiveness, that whole just be confident thing. Plus, we'll question whether those self-help gurus have all the answers. Oh, and get this. We'll explore how Islamic tradition actually offers a unique perspective on all this.
It's funny how we often separate those things in our minds, right?
Yeah.
Like self-help is over here and Islamic thought is way over there. But as we'll see, they connect in some pretty interesting ways.
Totally. Our guide for this deep dive is Dr. Yasser Al-Hazimi. He was recently interviewed, and he does not hold back.
He really doesn't. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating. He really makes you rethink those assumptions about personal growth.
Okay, so let's jump right into it with his take on assertiveness. That advice, just be more confident. Well, he kind of tears that apart.
He does. He says it's not about becoming some, aggressive jerk. It's about finding that middle ground between being a pushover and like exploding over every little thing.
He gives this very relatable example. Imagine a car almost hitting you, right? Do you cower in fear, or do you, unleash a wave of fury? Neither one is great.
Exactly. Dr. Al-Hazimi talks about calmly but firmly standing your ground. You assert your right to safety without letting things escalate.
It's like you have rights too, just like everyone else, and fulfilling your obligations doesn't mean being a doormat.
Exactly. It's knowing that balance, not demanding more than you deserve, but also not settling for less. Cultivating that inner strength to handle tough situations, but with, grace and firmness. And get this, he connects it to faith.
You mean that idea of trusting in a higher power, like having faith in God's plan?
Yeah, exactly. He uses this really interesting analogy of riding a roller coaster. People will wait in line for that thrill of fear, knowing they're safe.
Because they trust the engineers, the safety measures, so the fear becomes exciting.
Right. He's saying we can apply that same trust to other areas of life, whether it be a job interview or a presentation. If you've prepared, you've done your best, the outcome, that's in God's hands. That trust, that faith can be really empowering.
It's not about eliminating fear or anxiety completely, but understanding those feelings and trusting in something bigger than ourselves. It's a different way of looking at it than what you usually hear in the self-help world.
And that leads us right into his critique of modern self-help, specifically what he calls the guru effect. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, absolutely. It's like everyone's trying to sell you the secret to success, but it's usually just one person's experience, and they act like it's some universal truth.
Right. He uses this example of someone who claims to read like 6,000 words per minute and build a whole method around it. Then it's marketed as something anyone can achieve, and if you don't, well, you must be doing something wrong.
Which is ridiculous. Everyone learns differently, has different strengths.
Exactly. Trying to force yourself into some mold just leads to self-doubt, or even worse, pretending to be someone you're not. And that's where it gets dangerous.
Because then you're not being authentic.
And that lack of authenticity, it holds you back from real growth. He stresses accepting yourself, your own pace, your unique journey.
And this is where things get really interesting. He challenges this whole idea of relying solely on Western psychology for self-improvement.
He's actually quite critical of it. He asked, did a civilization that led the world for 1,000 years really have nothing to offer about the human psyche?
It makes you think, because obviously that's not true. He points to scholars like Al-Ghazali, who centuries ago developed sophisticated frameworks for self-understanding.
And these weren't just abstract theories. They were rooted in a deep understanding of human behavior, motivations, even the spiritual side of things. And that's what he feels is missing from a lot of modern self-help, that ground, that connection to something deeper and more lasting.
It's like we're so caught up in the quick fix, the instant gratification, that we've lost sight of the wisdom that's been passed down for generations.
In a way, yeah. He uses this great analogy to explain how different minds approach knowledge. Imagine walking into a cluttered room.
So we're picturing a cluttered room. Some people walk in and just see a mess. Others might straighten up a bit, but they're not changing the layout or anything.
Right. But he says the real masters of knowledge, they approach that room differently. They don't just rearrange the existing clutter. They empty the room out. They examine each piece, each object.
Okay, so they're not just taking in information, they're analyzing it, understanding it.
Exactly. Then they rebuild. But they do it in a way that makes sense, in a way that's both beautiful and functional. And that's what he sees in traditions like Islamic thought, not just as a religion, but as a source of real wisdom.
It's interesting, though, he doesn't shy away from talking about the pitfalls he sees within his own tradition.
Oh, absolutely. He's not saying to blindly accept everything, even if it's rooted in tradition. He talks about those who try to force modern self-help trends into Islamic teachings.
And it ends up being a mismatch, right? Like trying to blend oil and water.
Exactly. He says it distorts both. It's not about slapping a religious label on something to make it more acceptable. It's about understanding the core principles, the deeper meaning.
It's about getting to the heart of it.
Right, like that whole be positive all the time thing. You hear that a lot in self-help circles.
Which, let's face it, is not realistic. Life is full of ups and downs.
Exactly. And pretending otherwise doesn't make the negative emotions go away. He actually cautions against suppressing negative emotions altogether.
It's like denying a part of yourself.
Exactly. He encourages acknowledging those feelings, figuring out where they're coming from, and then you can choose how to respond to them.
So it's about finding that balance again. Not letting negative emotions control you, but not pretending they don't exist.
Yes. And he gives this great example related to tawakkul, which means reliance on God. Some people misinterpret that to mean, if I'm meant to get this job, I'll get it. No need to prepare for the interview.
So they use faith as an excuse for inaction.
Exactly. He's highlighting the nuance. Having faith is important, but so is putting in the effort. One doesn't negate the other.
This reminds me of another important point he makes about setting healthy boundaries, especially in our closest relationships.
Yes. He says fulfilling your obligations to others shouldn't come at the expense of your own well-being.
He uses this phrase that really stuck with me. The original state of general relationships is overlooking faults and showing respect, while the original state of close relationships is honesty and harmony. That's a powerful distinction.
It is. He's saying in casual interactions, yeah, let the little things slide. But with close relationships, honesty is crucial.
So you're not saying to avoid conflict in close relationships?
Not at all. He actually warns that constantly overlooking issues can be really harmful in the long run. If something is genuinely bothering you, you need to address it.
Because otherwise it just builds up resentment. But how do you approach those difficult conversations without making things worse?
He gives some guidelines for when overlooking a fault might be appropriate. First, is it likely to change? Is this just part of who they are?
So if it's a deeply ingrained trait, maybe you pick your battles.
Right. And then how often does it happen? Is it a one-time thing or a constant pattern? And finally, can you genuinely let it go without holding on to resentment?
It's about discerning between those little quirks we can live with and behaviors that are truly harmful.
And he's very clear, staying silent out of fear,
Yeah.
that's not overlooking. He calls that weakness. True overlooking comes from a place of strength. You choose to focus on the positive aspects of the relationship.
It's about being intentional, about making a conscious choice. So you're saying it's about knowing when to speak up and when to let go.
Yes. And even when you decide to address an issue, he emphasizes doing it constructively. He talks about what he calls the theory of honking.
Okay, this sounds interesting. Tell me more about this honking theory.
So imagine someone's reversing their car towards you. What do?
You honk the horn, right?
A quick, firm honk just to get their attention.
And most of the time, that's all it takes.
Exactly. They realize their mistake and they correct it. But what if they don't?
Then you lay on the horn.
Well, not quite. That's where the honking theory comes in. You gradually increase the intensity. You don't just go from 0 to 60.
So it's about measured escalation.
Exactly. You give the other person a chance to respond before resorting to more, well, extreme measures.
I like that. It makes sense not just with driving, but with any disagreement. It's about being assertive, but also being mindful of how you communicate.
Yes. It's about finding that balance between being passive and being aggressive. And remember, assertiveness isn't about always getting your way. It's about advocating for yourself, even if the other person doesn't agree.
It's about knowing what you deserve and not being afraid to say it, but doing it in a way that you can be proud of.
Right, with respect.
Yeah.
He's not just talking about communication, though. He's talking about how we approach self-improvement as a whole. Like Dr. Al-Hazimi is encouraging us to really think for ourselves.
So we shouldn't just follow every trend or take everything we hear at face value.
That's it. Question everything. He says we need to be more conscious, more discerning.
Instead of always chasing the next big thing, maybe we should look at the wisdom that's been around for centuries, you know?
Exactly. He calls it intellectual bankruptcy. This idea that we've become so reliant on outside sources that we've forgotten the treasures in our own traditions.
It's like we've become so focused on the new that we've forgotten the value of what we already have.
Right? It's not about rejecting everything new, but realizing that there's so much wisdom to be found in those ancient traditions.
Those traditions have shaped who we are, right?
Absolutely. He uses this really powerful metaphor to explain this. He talks about how different minds approach knowledge. Some, they enter a room and just kind of look around, observe, but they leave it exactly as they found it.
Others might move a few things around, but they're not really changing anything fundamental, are they?
Not really.
They don't leave their mark.
But then there are those, the true masters of knowledge, the ones who leave a lasting impact, and they do something different.
They really get in there and shake things up.
They do. He says they roll up their sleeves, they empty the whole room, they examine each and every piece.
They really get to know the pieces, inside and out.
And then they rebuild. But they do it in a way that reflects their own understanding, their own unique insight.
So they take those existing pieces and create something entirely new. It's like they're not just rearranging, they're reimagining.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what he's encouraging us to do with knowledge. Don't just passively absorb it. Really engage with it. Question it. Combine it with your own experiences.
Make it your own.
Exactly. And that's how you create something new, something meaningful.
What I'm hearing is that he's advocating for a more holistic approach to self-improvement.
I think so too.
It's about taking the best of what modern psychology has to offer, but also recognizing the depth and the wisdom of those older traditions, like Islamic thought in his case.
And even if you're not coming from a specifically religious perspective, I think his message is so relevant.
It's about recognizing that true self-improvement, it's not one size fits all.
It's a journey, and we get to choose what we bring along with us.
I love that. He leaves us with this really thought-provoking question he asks. Are we chasing trends or are we seeking wisdom?
It's such an important question because we are bombarded with so much information these days.
It can be hard to sift through it all and figure out what really matters.
It can, and maybe the answers we're looking for are closer than we think.
Maybe they're right in front of us, in the traditions and wisdom that have been passed down to us.
It's something to think about.
Wow, we covered a lot today. This deep dive has given us so much to unpack, from assertiveness to questioning those self-help gurus to rediscovering the wisdom in our own traditions.
It's been a great conversation.
And you know, Dr. Al-Hazimi's insights remind us that self-improvement is an ongoing journey.
It's not about reaching some finish line.
It's about continuously learning, growing, and striving to be better versions of ourselves.
However we define that for ourselves.
Exactly. And who knows, you might just find that exploring those overlooked parts of your own heritage, your own traditions, might just lead you down a path of incredible growth and self-discovery.
It's worth exploring.
That wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did.
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Let us know what resonated with you, what surprised you.
And if there are other deep dives you'd like us to take, let us know.
Until next time, keep exploring.
And keep diving deep.